Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, we have on Tracy and Leonardo, who authored the book Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. They are also the co-founders of the LA Tenants Union, which is a really successful, really inspiring movement based out of LA that is fighting for tenants, survival and community against the housing crisis, landlords, the corrupt government, etc. This conversation is incredibly detailed, wide-ranging. They're both brilliant, and they're equipped not only with theoretical knowledge, but with the wisdom that can only be forged through real organizing experience. So this is an essential listen for anybody at all engaged in or interested in becoming engaged in the tenant union struggles, creating your own tenant union, fighting against, the depredations of the housing crisis in your community, etc. But also for people who organize more broadly. There's so many incredibly important strategic and tactical points made, so many crucial connections with all these seemingly disparate problems and issues in our society, wrangling them all together and showing how they're all deeply and inexorably connected, and so much more. I really found this conversation enriching and engaging and generative in profound ways. So I'm very excited to release this episode and to encourage people to go check out the book and learn from the example set by the comrades in the LA Tenants Union. And as always, if you like what we do here at Rev Left Radio, you can support us at patreon.com/Rev Left Radio. We are 100% listener funded, always have been, always will be, and it makes a huge difference in me and my producers' lives. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Tracy and Leonardo about their newest book, Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis.
Hi, I'm Tracy Rosenthal. I'm a writer and a tenant organizer. I'm here with my mentor, Leonardo Vilchis, and we just wrote Abolish Rent that is now out with Haymarket Books.
Hello, I'm Leonardo, also a co-writer with Abolish Rent with Tracy, and I'm community organizer with the LA Tenants Union at the Unión de Vecinos Eastside Local, which predates the LA Tenants Union.
Beautiful. Well, it's a pleasure to have both of you on. LA Tenants Union, as I was saying before we started recording, has been inspirational for many like-minded tenants organizations across the country, including here in Omaha. So it's a real pleasure to have both of you on and to learn from your organizing experience and the sort of knowledge that comes from years and years of actually on-the-ground organizing in your community, something the left clearly needs as our only real path to power is organizing, right? We can sit online and we can have our different ideologies and our little disputes, but the rubber hits the road when we put the theory that we've learned into action. And that's precisely what you're doing around a core issue, which is housing, the ability for people to have shelter over their heads. I mean, it doesn't get much more materialist than that. So let's go ahead and get into it. And first and foremost, I want to examine the terrain of the housing crisis that is at the core of this book and, the tenant organizing movement more broadly. Historically, housing security and high rent and slumlords and homelessness have always been a site of struggle for poor and working class people. But in the last several years, especially since 2008 and then 2020, the crisis has only deepened. And I think anybody that, has a little bit of age on them, I was born in the late 80s, so there was a sort of time before where the change when it comes to homelessness, the cost of housing has been incredibly apparent. We've lived through a real deepening of this crisis, and we've seen it with our own eyes. And of course, if you live in any major city in the United States, you see the homelessness crisis on a daily basis. So with all of that in mind, can you kind of orient our listeners to the scope and depth of the crisis, where it kind of comes from, and why it remains a central site of struggle for working people today?
Yeah, that's a great way to start out. I mean, I think that we should just start by saying that foundationally, we live in a capitalist system that, and that system demands that we pay to access a basic human need. As you said, the human need of housing, having shelter over our heads, that is at the center of so much of our lives, like our most intimate moments, our connection to our communities, and that housing also, our ability to have housing decides so much about our life, like, our life outcomes, whether or not our health is stable, whether or not we have access to decent education, or we're, exposed to environmental harms, right? Like that our housing really sits at the center of all of these things. And in our system, I think that we often hear this fantasy of, the housing system, there's just it just needs to be tinkered. There's only like a little bit wrong with it. If only we like deregulate, or if only we, added a little tweak, we would be able to fix the system. But I think that it's really important to recognize that, like, the capitalist housing system has never provided access to safe and stable housing, particularly for poor and working class people. And that is historical, through the history of capitalist development, that has been the case. And that is, to a large extent because this system is one of exploitation and domination. This is not a system that exists to distribute the best quality housing to the most tenants. It is a system that exists to produce the most profits and extract the most rents. And in that system, tenants are required at the peril of their need and at the barrel of a gun to pay a monthly tribute to people already richer than us. And that is the basis of this system, that not only do we have to pay for housing because we need it, we have to pay for housing because if we don't, our landlords who have a monopoly on state violence can call on the agents of the state to throw us out of our homes using physical force. And then if we end up outside, because it is effectively illegal to be homeless, those same agents of the state can throw us in a cage because we don't have housing. So we not only are trapped in this system because we need housing, we're trapped in it because it is a crime not to have it. In this sense, it is a crime not to be exploited by a landlord. And so I know I've gone on, but I think that it's really important. And it's in those places of monopolization of state violence that we really start to understand what is the state's role in maintaining this form of exploitation and domination that we call our housing system, right? And as you said, the deepening of that crisis is in many ways a decision, is in many ways a reflection of the deepening love affair between the state and real estate and the abandonment of tenants to the private market over and over again, the removal of any forms of protections or market interventions that we had, and basically, that over time, the state's continuing role in inflating property values on the one hand and abandoning tenants on the other. And so I think that where we're at now is really the result of, the base fact of our capitalist housing system combined with a state that has completely refused to intervene in it in any way to materially benefit our lives.
Yeah. Well said. Leonardo?
Yeah, on my mind, just to add a little bit or to look at also another part of this thing, it's also a question of how it's becoming more visible here in the United States. I'm an immigrant from Mexico, and from the time I remember, I grew up in Acapulco. The land occupations and people's displacement by the state and the struggle for a place to live has always been part of my life since I remember. And when I look around in other places, in Brazil, in South Africa, and all these places, this struggle has been going on forever everywhere else. It is just now recently that the United States is becoming aware of the crisis, as the number of tenants is growing, as the middle class is being pushed out of their homes in 2008, as the system is being unable to respond to the situation. More and more people are aware of it, and more people are asking, how do we fight back? And from my perspective, the answer is on the third world, in an organized movement of people who forces the state to respond to the situation. And that's just one thing that I just think in the United States, just the poor were invisible. The system was able to give concessions to movements and hide the problem and split people. But as the crisis grows, as there is less and less jobs, as the industrialization continues to grow, as people don't have any answers to places, as people move out of the United States into Mexico and other places, we can see that this is more and more visible. And yet, we hide behind a system that supposedly can solve it, the market. And that's where everything that Tracy is saying is relevant, right? The market is not going to address the conditions of housing for the most poor, for the middle class. The market is just there for people to become rich and for people to turn things into commodities. So it's part of our history. It's part of the history of capitalism. It's part of the stratification of labor. And housing is just as stratified as labor is. And we can see it from the 19th century and reading Engels' book, The Housing Question.
Yeah, great point, and very well said. And, it makes me think of the fundamental difference, or the way that I put it in the most succinct way, the difference between, socialism and capitalism, is that capitalism organizes society fundamentally around the right for a relatively small amount of people to exploit and extract profit from the masses of people. Like, that's the organizing principle of everything in capitalist society: healthcare, housing, childcare, education. Everything is an extractive event for a small amount of ruling class people to take wealth from it's a fundamentally redistributive system, right? Taking wealth from the bottom and middle and siphoning it to the top. And what the core orientation of socialism is for me is, how can we use the wealth and labor that we have in society collectively and cooperatively to create the highest quality of life for the most amount of people? Those two orienting principles are the core of the differences that we have with the capitalist system, and is at the core of our critique of the capitalist system. And when it comes to something like housing, as we were talking about in the intro, the most fundamental in many ways, material need of human beings, shelter, we can see how capitalist orientation radically distorts things away from what's good for people and towards what's good for a few already incredibly wealthy people. And I can never forget that the term landlord is just so condescending and comes from feudalism. Yes. It's literally a hangover.
Holdover. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really important that we maintain the name landlord in a context where landlords themselves are desperate to rebrand themselves as housing providers, right? But if we put numbers to exactly the dynamic that you were describing, there are some 11 million landlords and almost 150 million tenants. And what is our system designed to do, right? If the purpose of a system is what it does, then our housing system extracts trillions of dollars from tenants and ejects them into the streets. And that's why, in our book, we name it as an unhousing system, that because of those dynamics that you named, right? That is the result. And I think that not only is it important, that is a self-perpetuating system, that it is one that is implicated in the perpetuation of inequality, because as we're, paying this monthly tribute to our landlords, they are using those resources to hoard more and more of the spaces where we can live, right? And it's also important to name that our landlords don't own our housing because they're smarter than us, better than us, more hardworking than us. In fact, the average landlord works 4 hours a month maintaining a property, right? But the way that they get to extract rent from us is by hoarding the places where human beings can live. And that, we quote one landlord in the book who said, banks buy me the house, tenants pay off the mortgage, property manager handles everything, inflation builds me massive wealth, real estate, right? That is the system that landlords, when they're not crying to the state about what minimal tenant protections we have, that is the system that they're advocating. That's the system that we're propping up. And I think also the role of the state in this inflating of property values, in this fantasy of economic growth that is then siphoned off by this minority elite. I think that dynamic is just really, really central to what we're describing.
Yeah, and we can see it in the actual work. I remember when I first came to Los Angeles in 1986, there were still a lot of people who lived in these buildings that were owned by small property owners. And of course, things were not better then, but the whole idea that at least the tenants had a relationship one-to-one with the landlord in a horrible relationship of struggle, but you could see who your enemy was and you could negotiate with that enemy face to face. Little by little, those homes have been sold to other people and to other agencies, and now these agencies are hiring managers. And now the landlord is farther and farther away from the tenant, and it's actually a lot of times even more difficult to identify. And that also talks about the higher concentration of land that is occurring at the corporate level, and how distance and how more complex the struggle is become for tenants. And that's why the relationship and the importance of creating a counterbalance to this relationship, where basically tenants have to form their own organizations to fight back, and neighborhoods have to organize to fight back against this balance of power, where only a few corporations own more and more land, and they use all the mechanisms that they have, political, ideological, and police, to exercise their power in our communities. And our neighbors, they used to think, we can move to another house if we have a problem with this landlord. But now it's the same thing. It's another corporation with another manager that is abusing them and extracting as much money as they can from them. And if they don't respond, then they get kicked out onto the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. In a rational, moral society, the state would be the thing that steps in to mediate this conflict. But of course, we understand under capitalism, the state is just a manifestation of class power. And so the state is always on the side of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist, of the landlord, et cetera. And I really appreciate Tracy's point about this term landlord and actually sticking with it and not letting them play this neoliberal language game where they try to obscure material relational reality through this, softening of these words that also is self-aggrandizing. Like you said, this idea that they're housing providers is bullshit. Materially, they don't provide, they hoard and extract. They don't build, they don't provide anything really. They work 4 hours a month per property, etc. But I think that's a hallmark of the neoliberal era. Neoliberalism sort of in one way protects capitalism from the threat of democracy by privatizing everything. And then instead of any real reforms, any real power change, any shift in the status quo whatsoever, that's shut off. So what we do instead is play language games. We try to shift the words that we use to describe reality instead of actually changing reality. And I think, that is an insidious aspect of neoliberalism. But Leonardo sort of segued into this, sort of alluded to this, the individual landlord that owns a few properties is now being increasingly displaced by these huge, sort of, in many cases, faceless corporations. So I'm wondering broadly, kind of what role do private equity, huge developers, the real estate lobby, NIMBYs, right? We hear them sometimes. What role do these different forces play in maintaining the status quo of the crisis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I mean, I think that, we should both, describe that fundamentally the ordering of space, the ordering of where people can live is determined basically in collaboration between our bosses and our landlords, right? Like the places where we need to work and the people that we pay money to in order to access the human need of shelter, right? And that has been true throughout history. But what we've seen now, right, as and I think also to name that it's in many ways democratic politicians who have been the innovators of these neoliberal reforms that have struck down the barriers between the financial markets and banks and shaped our housing system to grow the power of speculators in that system. And so we have seen the rise of private equity that is has been empowered by the state to claim more and more of our homes, with the rise of Invitation Homes to now the largest landlord in the country. In Los Angeles, 75% of tenants live in homes that are owned by investment vehicles, right? So these actors are taking over more and more space. And we have the sort of, now we're in the era of, the scandal, for instance, the RealPage scandal, right, which demonstrated that landlords are engaged in a process of price fixing via algorithm, and that they are these private equity firms are buying in specific strategic ways to fix the market. But yeah, but I think it's important that we recognize that like that is systemic in the market, that landlords and developers are collaborating to use their class power and preserve their class interest, right? To raise rents. And then when we think about, I also think it's important to point out that there's nothing necessarily worse about a large landlord in the sense that, the power relationship between landlords and us is experienced differently depending on who owns our housing. Yet both of those landlords, I think that they access forms of exploitation and forms of domination differently, right? Like in our experience, organizing mom and pop landlords, like organizing buildings owned by mom and pop landlords, those are some of the most violent, like the use of direct violence against tenants, the use of like extreme measures to evict people from their homes illegally. I've said, the pouring concrete in a toilet, macing tenants, breaking down doors with a pickaxe, right? Like these are some of this is the level of brutality that we see in small landlords. So I think it's important not to romanticize them as necessarily better, but then to recognize that when large landlords are using bunk legalese to run tenants through the eviction process, right? Like what is eviction court? It is an automation of that low-level violence, right? And so they have access to those like deep pockets that allows them to automate that process. But nonetheless, like that's true for both actors.
Yeah, I mean, so some of this conversation reminds me, when I came in the 1980s to Los Angeles, one of the biggest crises we had was in the community where I was working and in the largest public housing west of the Mississippi, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. The biggest problem was the gangs. And a lot of the stuff that we were talking about around that time was the fact that the youth were no longer needed as laborers or as consumers, because basically what was happening in Los Angeles, and I think it's larger part of the United States, it was this whole process of the industrialization, right? Los Angeles was moving from a large industry place where cars were being built and the aerospace industry was involved to a place where basically we were moving into the service sector. So education for the youth was no longer needed. The schools were in crisis, and a lot of these youth were being pushed out of the schools into the streets, and they were forming the gangs, and there was all these other situations. At the same time, we have this movement towards privatization of the schools. So basically, the school system in California, who was supposed to be very, very advanced, I never got to see that, it started decaying. And then we have the youth crisis with gangs and violence and all this other stuff, together with the crack cocaine epidemic and these different situations. And so that change creates a surplus population that were no longer necessary. And how do they solve the problem eventually? With the jail system. And we've all heard about the privatization of jails and the growth of the prison industrial complex. Well, literally the same thing that is happening here in Los Angeles. And we're looking at the same thing. As the industry has changed, as we become more of a service industry, and as really there is no more jobs and there is nothing, and Los Angeles becomes a tourist community, or it's becoming sort of like a spectacle community. We're having the Olympics coming up. There are stadiums that are being built. The housing that exists for the working class and the working poor is no longer necessary. Housing also follows labor and stratification. That's why you have different levels of housing. But the market right now doesn't need to produce the housing for what used to be workers in the larger service sector or for workers who work in the industry. So it becomes land for speculation. And these small owners, hold on to whatever they have. And yes, they become these abusive monsters that abuse their tenants because they know that there is no more housing around for the tenants to move on to. And that's one of the things that we've seen in our community. We used to be, when we were organizing, that it was difficult to organize people because they would say, I'm going to move somewhere else. That somewhere else doesn't exist anymore. Everybody's trapped in the homes that they have, and everybody else is being pushed outside of the city. That's a change in the economic conditions and in the mode of production of the city. That's a change in the larger industrialization of the country. So land and housing are becoming this type of commodity where we are trapped in terms of what we can choose and not choose. And guess what? It doesn't matter what party is in power. Both parties are in support of this transition. In Los Angeles, the destruction of public housing has been basically endorsed, promoted, and encouraged by the Democrats. And right next to them are the non-profit organizations that just don't see any option to fight back, or basically are looking for other justifications and other ways to reduce the impact that this is having, right? By expanding rights, by talking about mythical cooperatives or land trusts. But really, the crisis of housing is growing and growing and growing, and people are being pushed out because this housing is no longer needed for these people. This housing now is needed for speculation and for extract as much money as possible from it as they can. And the state, the non-profit industrial sector, the corporations are selling us the idea that the market is going to solve the problem. And it's not solving it. Or that affordable housing is going to do anything for us, but it's not affordable for the most poor. So our communities have to fight to stay where they're living, have to fight to stay in their homes, have to fight against evil landlords, have to stay in their neighborhoods against gentrification, have to stay in the city against a court system that pushes them out, have to stay in the country. I mean, it's crazy. People are being pushed out of the city because of this system, because of the changes in the system and the modes of production.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that, Leo. And I just wanted to specifically answer your question about NIMBYs, right? Because I think it's, when we understand, in our book, we describe the history of housing policy as a war on tenants. And I think it's important to understand the function of homeownership throughout American history as a political and economic project that has recruited working class people into alignment with elite interests, right? And that is an explicitly anti-communist project. It was from the get. And we can see that like rehearsed over and over again in the history of housing policy, like going all the way back, right, to the counterinsurgency against Black Reconstruction when white people were given, white people were recruited into alignment with capital through the capture of through settlement, through the capture of indigenous land, right? And this process happens over and over again that, when in the GI Bill, when the state creates the subsidies that lure people to the suburbs, right? Like this isn't white flight. This is like white chasing subsidies to the suburbs, right? And abandoning people of color to the cities, right? And then we see this again specifically in our context, right? Like in the tax revolt, in the counterinsurgency to the late 60s social movements, that what homeowners in California do is they give themselves the equivalent of rent control. They win stabilization of property taxes. And in so doing, like that form of austerity is actually a form of discipline on Black, brown, poor people in the cities. So this is the project. And I mean, Mike Davis obviously writes so beautifully about this. But this is the project that has produced the class interests of, how people are recruited in many ways against their own interests, the production of the middle class via homeownership, and the ideological project of homeownership as the American dream is really just a withdrawal of the public of the public good, of the state's role in maintaining a social safety net and public services, and its replacement with these like private tiny kingdoms with a garage out front, right? Like that is the historical dynamic that really gives us the context that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I think it becomes more evident in 2008 with the housing with the crisis of people losing their homes, and I think that's the other side of it is how people buy into it. I remember when we were fighting against the demolition of the housing projects, the 900 families that were displaced. What part of the dream for most of them was, to live in a better community, to eventually own their home, and then find a better place. So when the housing authority and the government comes and says, we're going to give you Section 8 vouchers for you to move somewhere else, and from then on to build up to get your American dream, a lot of people were buying into it without realizing that once they were out there, the housing was not going to be existent. There was also the false promise that some of these people were going to be able to buy homes. And again, they were endorsing the destruction of their whole community without thinking of people that were coming behind them. And at the end of the day, for example, in Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, there were 7 families that were able to buy their homes. And out of those 7 families, only one or two were able to keep their homes in 2008. Afterwards, everybody went into the street. When we talked to the tenants in the 80s and 90s also, we were talking about, we have to improve the housing. A lot of them would tell us, no, we're just saving so we can buy a new home. And again, in 2008, that thing falls apart. So this dream also is an ideological tool that makes people slow down or ignore the current present condition in the place that they were living in, because they were thinking that at some point they were going to be able to move out. So that's another thing that is very, very important. And again, I want to go back to the nonprofits and the corporations. When we moved out of the housing projects, a lot of people were being told, there is this affordable housing system, and we need to fight for more funding for the affordable housing system. And we fought for that. And when people started applying for this affordable housing, they realized that they wouldn't qualify. So then we started fighting for more rights for tenants. And when we said, let's build a tenants union, let's build a system where tenants can organize, and we'll go to the foundations of the organizations, they would say, oh, no, that's not the solution. The solution is to increase incomes and have minimum wage campaigns and to produce more housing, which again takes you to this idea that you as an individual worker can achieve the American dream and get the American house and have an American life. With reality, they're just smoke and mirrors for people to stop realizing and fighting for their own to change their own reality in the present time.
Yeah, absolutely crucial points, and you're making these deep-seated connections historically, institutionally, ideologically about how all of these pieces fit together. And that's one of the things that I think is superior about, a socialist and dialectical materialist analysis over a liberal analysis, which wants to take everything, separate it up, and analyze it in its own right. Like, we call it the John Oliver effect, where every week he's talking about the problems of capitalism, but never ties those problems together. To Leonardo's point, I mean, there's so many amazing points. I just want to touch on 2 really quick, and then I'll go to the next question. The way in which prisons have not only been privatized and are sites of extraction of labor and profit, but are also the main mechanism that the neoliberal state uses to not solve social problems, but to hide them away. And then by hiding them away, sort of concentrating them and then extracting them mercilessly for even more profit. It's really, really brutal. And then to Tracy's point, I think it's so important to really hone in on this point and to reiterate that this nostalgia for mom and pop capitalism is a complete bullshit lie that we should completely reject and resist whenever we hear it come up, because not only in the housing market, like you've described, mom and pop landlords are sometimes the most brutal, the least accountable. It's also true in the workplace, right? This idea that like all big corporations are the problem. If we just had mom and pop capitalism, that would at least be better. My worst jobs, the ones that I've been taken the most advantage of, have been in these really unaccountable, single proprietor, mom and pop business where it's just the one guy's whim. Everything happens according to his mood and his whims. There's no HR department. There's no mechanism of redressing grievances. And so just a really great point. And I just wanted to expand that to work, because I think sometimes there is that
for sure
naive nostalgia about mom and pop capitalism, right?
Yeah. Before we move on, I just wanted to make the point too, right? Like, when we think about prisons, I know that privatization can sometimes come up as that kind of exquisitely horrific form that they are taking. But also, like, I think we need to recognize that our prisons are a form of public housing. We spend $200 billion in taxes and debt on these facilities, like on human cages that arose after, after the attacks on public housing and the destruction on public housing. And also we spend $200 billion in lost subsidies on private homes. And so I think that when we think about like, what does our, what is housing policy? How does the state interact with the housing market? We need to look at both of those things as the two poles of what the state's role in housing is. It spends the same amount of money caging people, providing them the carceral housing as punishment, and on propping up the system of private ownership that, allows wealth to be transferred through families and maintains the racial wealth gap and the consolidation of wealth in this country and perpetuates inequality. And so I think that putting those two things at the forefront of our analysis really helps us recognize what is the state doing to prop up the system that we're in.
If I may take a couple seconds before you ask your question also, I want to take on your comment about the mom and pop businesses, because they're also part of the struggle, part of the wage that is being driven within our communities. In our fight against gentrification in Boyle Heights, those are the small mom and pop businesses are the ones who get in the way, because basically the whole promise that more investment and more money is going to come to the community makes these businesses fight in favor of gentrification and support the displacement of their own customers. And it's very interesting to see in this process, and we've seen it in Echo Park and other parts of the community, where these small businesses support gentrification, support this so-called investment, and they benefit from that investment and for those changes for a very short time, because what happens after that, there's all these businesses and all these corporations that they start coming and have a completely different agenda from the construction of a community or of a better place for people. It's just basically turning these neighborhoods in commercial corridors for high-end goods and luxury goods, just basically to promote a consumer society and really to displace the people who live in the neighborhood. And this is very dangerous, because basically it goes back to this atomization of the struggle, right? The small entrepreneur, the small family who owns a business, who supposedly eventually are going to triumph and achieve the American dream, become their own worst enemies, because they're the ones who divide the community, and they're the ones who encourage these kind of processes. And at the end of the day, they get displaced from the process itself. And in the meantime, also, then you have the individual homeowners that say, okay, now is my time to invest. And then they start kicking out their neighbors, their tenants from their housing, and again, dismantle the whole community. So the work of the Tenants Union, the work of our communities, of our locals, is not just to fight for the individual house and the individual tenant in their location, but it's about construction, a community within a building, within the neighborhood, that fights back against their own displacement and fights back against a system that promotes and encourages individualism in our communities.
Yeah. So important. Such a wonderful point. Absolutely. Now, I do want to shift gears slightly here and just talk a little bit, and we'll get back into these topics for sure, but talk a little bit about the creation and the backstory of LA Tenants Union.
Yeah. So at my local, the Unión de Vecinos East Side local, predates the creation of the LA Tenants Union. We got started in 1996. Fighting against the demolition of the public housing projects of Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, which at the time were the largest public housing west of the Mississippi. It's about mile square community of about 1,100 families who used to live in public housing. They used to pay a third of their rent in a very tight and dense community. And they were dealing with several kinds of issues. They were dealing with gang violence. They were dealing with immigration rates and with police violence. And there was this church, Dolores Mission Church, which was basically, through the work of the Jesuits and the priests there, started developing this process of community engagement, where basically, regardless of where your religion was or anything like that, we were getting small groups of community coming together to talk about the issues in the neighborhood. And little by little, as people were coming to talk about these issues, then we started talking about what is our response to these issues. And when it comes to the issue of the gangs, the community basically, rather than talk about sending them to jail or yelling them or disappearing them or pushing them out of our neighborhoods, the community started talking about developing a relationship with the gang members. So they started organizing these barbecues and having dinner with them, and little by little, through this relationship, they started learning to develop their own authority and basically intervening whenever there was violence, intervening to erase the graffiti, intervening to reduce the sale of drugs. So we had a community that was very tightly knit together, coming together to address their problems. As they started learning about the issues of intervening in the issues of gang violence, they also started intervening with the issues of police abuse. So as they developed a relationship with the gang members, they started learning about the violence that the gang members were going through because of the police, how the police would pick them up from one territory and take them to another place. So they started also intervening on those kinds of issues. So we had a community with a social consciousness that was trying to address their own problems, and that because of a state that was not able to solve anything, they had to do things themselves. And then lo and behold, Bill Clinton and the Democrats and everybody decides that the best thing to do is to destroy public housing. 100,000 units of public housing were planned to be demolished for the following 10 years in the United States. And they target this as one of the model places. And we have, the non-profits and organizations saying yes to the demolition. We have the Democrat government in the city council saying yes to the demolition. We have non-profit community development corporations saying yes to demolition. But the community was saying no to the demolition because they had developed a way to be community. They had developed a way to respond to the crisis. So we went and started fighting against the demolition. And it took us a while. First, we started slowing it down. Then we were able to develop a contract for our members of the Unión de Vecinos, to fight back and to get a contract that would give them a place to stay at the end of the development. Needless to say, the people who supported demolition and who supported this process were kicked out of the neighborhood and never came back. And the promise always was, this is going to improve your neighborhood. But they didn't realize that the neighborhood was going to be improved, but without them. So our members decided to stay. But that wasn't enough, right? We went to then pay attention to the people who moved out of the neighborhood and started looking at their conditions. And interestingly, their housing conditions were way worse than anything you can imagine in public housing in Los Angeles. Roaches, rats, bad inspections, abusive landlords, total disrespect of their rights. So we started fighting to defend the tenants, to organize the tenants around these issues. And we started creating these neighborhood committees to fight back. But the problem that we started realizing first when we started fighting against the demolition of the housing projects, and later on as we were trying to do this stuff in our neighborhood, was that the problem is citywide. And if you want to fight back and really have to have changes, you have to have changes across the city, and you have to build power across the city. And basically, in the public housing fight, the reason why we lost 2/3 of the population was because only a tiny minority was ready to fight all the way to the end, and they, by de facto, they had already won. So we just won a victory for our own members. So we started talking about the idea of forming a Tenants Union, and we started going to our friends in the nonprofit sector because we thought they're going to be interested. And there was always the constant answer, oh, we don't have capacity. There is no ways to do this stuff. Our funding doesn't allow us for us to get this money. It's not part of our mission, so on and so forth. Or we already have the strategies, and basically the strategies were negotiating the defeat of the tenants without having a fight. And then we went to the foundations, and the foundations were telling us, what we need is better salaries and more development. But also at the same time, we were part of this artist group called Ultra Rent that was started by Don Ryan here in Los Angeles. And these were artists from different parts of the world, at different parts of Los Angeles, coming together to look at the impacts of neoliberalism in Los Angeles. So we started doing all sorts of projects that built bridges with, for example, public housing in Ireland, with immigrants in Germany, and different groups of people. And we learned a lot in this process, exploring the impact of neoliberalism on our communities and developing social projects for reflection and discussion. But the tough part was that if you would come back to Los Angeles, the fight looked the same way. Everything was the same. Nothing was changing. We were still in a little island of organizing, trying to protect the housing of people, trying to improve their lives. So we decided to form what was called the School of Echoes. A School of Echoes was activists and people concerned, interested in addressing problems in their community. And our theme was, what are you hearing in your community? And little by little, interestingly, or as a reflection of the reality of the time, everybody was talking about gentrification, about housing conditions, about peoples and neighbors that were being lost and pushed away. And we came to the conclusion that really we needed to organize in the neighborhoods and come together and form something that could push back against this gentrification and this displacement. So we came up with the idea of the Tenants Union. And but again, a lot of people were people who were not part of they were not organizers. They were people who were interested and concerned for the community. And the question is, how do we start a Tenants Union? And it was kind of like nerve-wracking because we had already went through 10 years of trying to form a Tenants Union. And here we were in a new community of people who were interested. And the cool thing is that out of these hearings, we start inviting and bringing people together that we start joining these conversations. So there is this meeting that I remember very well where a bunch of us are together say, well, how do we start the Tenants Union? That we're like breaking our brains trying to figure out how do we start, what's the plan, the funding, et cetera, et cetera. And Tracy just daringly says, you know what? A union has members that are in struggle for the housing. I'm a tenant. Here's my $5. I'm the first member of a Tenants Union. And that was it really what launches us to say, to go beyond our fears and our concerns, to say, yeah, we are the Tenants Union and we're going to start fighting. So out of the different struggles that people, so Tracy is Tenant 0001 of the LA Tenants Union. But really is the one that launches us into this fight. So all of us went back to different struggles or places that we were having. So in South Central, there were tenants on Section 8 housing, and their covenant was ending, and they were fighting to stay or to gain more time. Nobody was supporting them, and the Tenants Union decided to support them. In Echo Park, there was all this criminalization of youth and all these laws that were attacking the youth to further the impact of gentrification in Echo Park, and people started fighting against these laws. In both heights, we started organizing with different tenants who were not in rent control, but were pushing out of their buildings. So all these different communities grew out of interested, concerned tenants and residents who were not impacted or brainwashed by neoliberalism, who were not impacted or brainwashed by the foundations, and who were willing and ready and daring enough to say, we started a Tenants Union. And that's what we are, basically. This is who we've been, a volunteer organization that is looking to put the tenants at the center of the struggle, that is focused on the tenants that are most affected by gentrification, all these processes, and that is building communities in the neighborhood that are fighting back.
Beautiful. Tracy?
Yeah. I just, I think that also I can talk about, the things that we learned in the course of our own development. And I like, being honest that like we are an experiment and we are ourselves changing over time. And, like our first, our first action as a union, we were like, maybe before, like as we were starting the union, our first group action was holding a renters' rights workshop, right? And there was this point where we realized like all three parts of that had to go, right? Like renters, because the category that exists in opposition to landlords, real estate developers, and politicians is broader than people who pay rent, right? It includes people who live outside. And so we really wanted to center tenants rather than just renters, to really name that category. Rights, workshop, right? Because like we recognize, we can't just like give people information and send them on their way. We want to build something long-term collectively, that people are invested in, that have that, the real democratic infrastructures that contrast to the forms of participation in many ways, like the value forms of participation that are offered in our, supposedly like representative democratic processes, right? And rights, because, like the rights that we want, which is the human right to housing, that is something that would take another kind of world, right? And we recognize, we quote James Boggs in the book to say like rights are what you make and what you take. And that like, recognizing that the rights we have are simply material that we can use to in the course of struggle for the rights that we really deserve, and that it wasn't enough to simply and even the rights that we have are barely enforced, right? And so then I think that it's been a process for us to really recognize, that over time, one of our most successful tenant associations, who we devote a chapter of the book to, the Mariachis in Boyle Heights, really demonstrates this principle in that they were able in their building, this was a non-rent stabilized building of 26 units in Boyle Heights, in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, like 2 blocks away from Mariachi Plaza, and where a third of the tenants, were mariachi musicians and relied on the plaza to pick up work. A new landlord buys the building and starts handing out rent increase notices, some up to $800 a month, right? Because this was not a rent stabilized building. The landlord is legally allowed to charge whatever the market, not we as tenants, can bear. And the tenants came together and, in the context, of accessing as individuals, like accessing social services or accessing lawyers or even accessing the long process of legislative reform, right? Like they would all, they would basically all be told that there was nothing that they could do. The laws were what they were. And, maybe that they could stall or slow down the process, but eventually they would all lose their homes. And this was an unacceptable answer to the tenants that had been living in this community, had been creating this community for decades. And they decided, to organize, to form an association, to engage the broader community and the broader union in their struggle. And through a year-long rent strike, they were able to bring their landlord to the bargaining table and win a collective bargaining agreement that was the equivalent for rent stabilization for their building. So this insight that rights are what you make and what you take, like that tenants themselves were able to change the conditions that governed their building, to invent a new contract and a new law, is really what is animating a lot of our work in the union. Similarly, and this idea that together, right, and in forming associations, in collectivizing risk, in working together in solidarity, in using our rent checks as forms of economic sanction on our landlord, in using our capacity, to take direct action and raise the social cost of evicting us, by, showing up at our landlord's door, by protesting that eviction, right? That these are tools that we have access together that are actually, these are the tools that are able to rebalance the scales of power between landlords and tenants, to give us more power and to actually give us more rights, to change the laws. And this is not something that we can do as individuals. This is only something that we have access to together. And that, I think, is, so to call us a union is also about naming those forms of power that we only have access to together.
Yeah. And I think this also points to the Tenants Union itself and the impetus of the people and the community that built up is something that is very surprising and very amazing. And I think it's something that is important in this history. But at the same time, this points to a crisis in the system. As Tracy was talking about, the lawyers, when we're talking about organizing tenants and we go to the lawyers, they're exhausted and overwhelmed. And all they have left to do for you is to negotiate your victory. And because that's all there is, because there is no funding, because the funding is restricted, because they're overwhelmed, because people don't want to take those jobs, because people want to make money. So the few lawyers that exist are overwhelmed and exhausted. The non-profit organizations that are dedicated to advocate for tenants are in a major contradiction between the mission of their organization, the funding that they receive, the fact that they're doing a job that they get paid for, and their ability to actually launch a movement across the city of tenants that can have an impact. So they go for strategic, tactical moves that give you some success and some progress, but that do not change the conditions on the ground for all the tenants in the city, because the funding is limited and because people are limited by the fact that they have a job. When it comes to the politicians have run out of policies. When you're talking about the pandemic, from the pandemic to today, the expansion of tenant rights has grown tremendously. There is more rights for tenants now than we had 20 years ago. But these rights can only be fought in court. So the policies that of these politicians that are giving us and granting us are not producing any change on the ground for people. Evictions continue to happen because people don't have the lawyers, because there are not enough advocates, and because the courts are designed to push people out. So the system is in crisis. When you look at the homeless in the city, we have a mayor that is recycling the same homeless through the same policies over and over and over. But the population of people in the streets continues to grow, the incumbents continue to grow, and she has all these policies and all these programs and systems, but it's the same homeless that are going through this process. And interestingly, they talk about, we have permanent house, people who are being housed permanently. How can a mayor who's been living for only 2 years in this city declare that people have been permanently housed? We don't know if they're going to permanently house until they live there for like 10, 15, or 20 years. This is just symbolic. So we have the politics of symbology with new rights and recycling the homeless through the system, the total defeat of the courts, and the fact that being an advocate and transforming the society is just a job that is paid by foundations. The Tenants Union unleashes that. The Tenants Union says, we in our communities can organize ourselves. We in our communities have to come together, but we need to come together as an organization that is commanded and controlled by the tenants, as an organization that is building territory in our locals, as an organization that is building a new kind of politics. And in this context, I think it's important to understand that we're talking not about just a political project, but a social, political, and cultural project. Social in the sense that, as Tracy was talking about, the mariachis and all these tenants, we're first building relationships across the tenants in an horizontal way for them to come together and understand that they have the same problems and that the only way they can address them is by coming together. Political, because we're building power, a power that now is having an effect. When the pandemic occurred in 2020, the tenants who could not pay the rent, instead of begging and crying and saying there is nothing we can do, they declared themselves and came out and said, we're not going to pay rent. And that forced the state to do something. Not what we wanted to, because basically all the money that the state gave was to the landlords, were at least protected and allowed for the tenants to stay in their homes. Because if we hadn't spoken out and we haven't come out and denounced the system and said, we're not going to pay rent, a lot of more evictions would have happened across the time. So it's political in the sense that we're building power, and pedagogical because we're learning about the fact that, yes, this is an experiment. We've only, how many years are we of the Tenants Union right now?
9.
God. 9. We're 9 years into Tenants Union, and we're still learning what the fight looks like. And different locals have their own responses to this situation. And we're coming with different experiments in different parts of the city. But it has to start with the tenants coming together, who now are more and more a majority. And it has to happen because the system is in crisis. The politicians, the Democrats, we're in a Democrat city, in a Democrat state, in the richest state in the country. And they cannot solve the problem. It is time for us to take control.
Yeah, brilliant and inspiring stuff. And I love your point about these formal tenant rights being a mirage of progress, which are then held up by liberal politicians as like real wins when they are actually very hollow and empty. And I love Tracy's point about this framing of living in community versus creating community. And that creation of community is a really interesting framework as opposed to merely living in an area. These are people's lives. These are their connections, their friends, their families, their coworkers, and their participation is an act of creation. So I really, really appreciated that. Let's go ahead and build on what you're talking about with the union, because in your book you highlight many of the strategies that your organization have employed in their fight against predation and exploitation. Can you talk about these marches, eviction defenses, rent strikes, and the creative strategies that you employ in the fight against the people in power?
Yeah, I mean, we can just take turns talking about some of them as they come
right.
up. In the forming of the Tenants Union, I think one of the things that caught my attention is basically that we were started doing things against the conventional wisdom or common sense, right? Like the fight for the tenants on Section 8, that if you did this 10, 15 years ago, And we said, the Section 8 tenants have lost their rights and their covenant is ending. Lawyers and organizations will say, there's nothing you can do. And we would just have to help these tenants, say, okay, help them move out somewhere else and do something. And yet we decided to fight back and take over the building and negotiate extra 10 years to stay in their building, which was really amazing. In East Hollywood, the organizers and the tenants in East Hollywood, they started taking on the whole situation of tenants just didn't know where their landlords live. And tenants didn't have a sense of how the landlord was benefiting from the rent. So they started these marches in the neighborhoods where the tenants were, where the landlords were living, shaming the landlords in front of their neighbors, pasting flyers all over the neighborhood, and calling out the landlord, and really forcing the landlord to negotiate and to give concessions to the tenants, which, again, before it didn't used to happen. You had to wait for an eviction to happen to help them. So here's the tenants themselves getting out of their neighborhood, calling all the tenants across the city to come and join them in the marches in the neighborhoods where people had never been before in all these tenants. In Boyle Heights, we have this situation where, something what happens sometimes when you're organizing tenants, you solve the problem of the tenant as a unit, and they say, okay, good, now I don't have to worry about it. But the problem is they don't look outside of their building, they don't look outside of their neighborhood, and they just missing out the problems that exist in the neighborhood. So basically, in our neighborhood, we also are talking about, covering the potholes, cleaning up the alleys, making alleys safer for the community. And in the process of engaging themselves on improving these alleys or putting stoplights or doing things like that, they take ownership of the larger neighborhood, and they also become leadership within the neighborhood that then supports them when they fight for their rights, or it starts pushing and negotiating for changes in the neighborhood. So in some cases, we've been able to get stoplights to slow down traffic, put stop signs in different places, put lighting on the alleys. We use the alleys as places to movie nights. During the pandemic, there was all these illegal evictions, and it was very interesting. The law protected these tenants from being pushed out of apartments, and we've had all the tenants would come back, take over I've been breaking into the homes and bringing the tenants back into the places. So these are some of the things that I can think of right now. I don't know if you can add or enhance some of the stuff that I was talking about, Tracy.
Yeah, I think that also just the way that you narrated is really important to us, is thinking, thinking of the union as, as an experiment and as a collection of these different locals that are responding to, that have the autonomy to respond to local conditions. East Hollywood, foregrounding direct confrontations with landlords, making evictions personal for the landlords in the way that it's personal for us. Like our Northeast chapter is really built around socializing the knowledge of struggle and bringing people together through, the geography that they're working with is a lot of people living in, small back houses where it's not, where they don't necessarily have the same tools, right? So how do they create the social base with people who have different landlords to come together and support each other as a collective in their unique struggles? Like our K-Town local, was really was formed around the K3 Tenant Council, which is a council of tenant associations who are all struggling against the same landlord. And so, thinking about how that building can, not be outside of their building to organize across a landlord's portfolio. And then thinking about the East Side, it's really, foregrounding strategies of reclaiming territory of the neighborhood, of reclaiming the alleys as backyards, building bus stops for seniors to sit waiting for the bus, painting crosswalks, and then engaging the state to extract those concessions from the state to change the conditions of the neighborhood. And so I think that, it's a way to say that, part of what we do is empower people to respond to their local conditions and then create the spaces of assembly where we can reflect on those actions. And I know that I'm quoting Leo, right, who often talks about how it is our, it's our practice to act our way into thinking, right? To start by, taking action in our material conditions and then reflect on what we did. And so that we can socialize that knowledge, share that knowledge, and grow our power as a union. I also think, one of the lessons that I think that we can take, is in so many ways, tenants have, what are the resources that we as a collective of tenants have to draw on, right? And those are, our rent checks that we've talked about. There are human relationships, right? There are the foundation of trust that we build with each other. That's forms solidarity. I often tell this story because it really sticks with me. But in the mariachi strike, when we interviewed one of the tenants about, what gave her the strength to continue in this process, and she said, eventually I got comfortable enough so that I could borrow an onion from my neighbor, right? So it's thinking politically about that form of neighborliness, right? That we should think about as a material of our struggle, right? And then ultimately, where are we getting our power in the union? In so many ways, it's simply by staying put. It's in our refusal to leave. Our working against our landlords' plans for what they want to do and staying in our housing. And this, when we're on strike, we're really have, temporary access to housing as a human right. And this is a form of occupation, right? And we learn, I think, a lot from, we really think about our organizing of unhoused tenants as the vanguard of the movement. And so, the occupation, thinking about occupations as the guide for the whole movement has been really important to us. And, we tell the story of, the Echo Park Rise Up, a group of, 150 unhoused tenants who claimed Echo Park Lake in the, before and then during the height of the federal pandemic emergency, and they claimed that space. And in so doing, they were able to organize, a community kitchen so people had access to food, survival supplies so that when people showed up with nothing, they would have a tent to sleep under. They would have shelter. They organized harm reduction, right? So that people in the community who were using drugs had access to Narcan. They, had a pact for collective safety. So and community watch. They built a garden so that they could grow plants and vegetables. They made their own showers, so that people had access to showers. And they brought, when the city, and in many ways, this was in opposition to they cleaned up their neighborhood, right? When the city refused trash pickup, when the city shut off the electricity, they organized with their solidarity networks to bring in battery packs so people had phones and access to, access to the rest of society. And so I think that we really learned from that reclamation of space, that claiming of territory, and people's, organizing their own resources to meet their own needs, and alongside solidarity from the broader union and the community. And that really, I think, shows us, they really showed us that they were solving the problems of state abandonment for themselves. They were redistributing their resources, meeting the needs for healthcare, for shelter, for community. And all of that, was being produced in this context of immense abandonment. And I think that when we take that seriously as a movement, it really shows us what we are capable of in reclaiming territory, in recirculating our resources, and imagining us as the managers of a new kind of society.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what's happening in the United States, the state is in major crisis. I mean, not that we ever had better options or anything like that. But I mean, just looking at the options that exist right now in the global context and the local context, the impact that they're going to have on the conditions of the most poor and the working class is just going to be at many levels irrelevant. Of course, we can talk about specific targeted things where maybe it would be better to have one over the other. But the reality is that overall, the system is not functioning at the economic and political level. Democracy has lost all credibility. So these spaces, these places where people are coming together, it's about the construction of a democracy. It's about people coming together and deciding to remain in their place and building community in the place where they live in and building a different kind of democracy that is from the bottom up, where basically everything that Tracy said, people set their priorities and act on those priorities because nobody else is going to do it for them. So when we think of the Tenants Union as a union that organizes tenants to address their crisis of housing, that's one side of it. The other side of it, we're talking about people in their neighborhoods coming together to take over their cities. And I think we need to think in those terms, because as you build power and the ability to remain where you live, then you have the power to then transform the place that you live in. And to do that, you have to have the organization that helps construct that power. So no matter who gets elected, you decide what's important for you and you act on it and force those who are in power supposedly to do what you need. Now, it's right now, it's just the beginning, it's a dream, but we've seen in every action that we've taken how the conditions have changed. When tenants decide to push back into their homes after they've been evicted illegally and the landlord does nothing, there you are. When the tenants of Northeast Los Angeles come together and learn from each other how to fight back in court without a lawyer, they're at win, there you are. When you have the tenants in Boyle Heights deciding where they want to stoplight and they get that stoplight, there you are. When the tenants of East Hollywood cross neighborhood borders and invade the territory of the landlords, there we are showing that power. All this is happening because in a building that is in a block, that is in a neighborhood, tenants are coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody that listens to those amazing responses will understand why, if you're at all interested or engaged in activism and organizing of any sort, but specifically around the housing crisis, this is a must-have resource for people to take advantage of out there. We do a lot of episodes with different tenant unions. We have one here in Omaha that we've had on the show many, many times. And I just want to take a second to recommend that they check out this book, support the authors, but just learn from this text and from these experiences that Leonardo and Tracy have, because they're so crucial, and that's the only way forward. It's the only way forward. The government's not going to save you. The Democratic Party's not going to save you. This broken system isn't going to reform itself. It's bottom-up community, mass-based power that is our only hope for a livable and decent future. Now, the title of the book is Abolish Rent, which is a revolutionary demand, keeping open the horizons of struggle beyond mere reforms to the existing system and toward a radically new one, wherein housing is not a commodity but a human right. So with that in mind, and I'm really interested in, as we get towards the end of this conversation, what is the ultimate vision that each of you hold for housing and beyond? And what does socialism or communism mean to you in this context?
I mean, I can tell the story of, one of the members of our South Central local, Inez, who, the way that she narrated the transformation of her thinking about communism by participating in the union, forming an association at Flower Drive, and, to stop the eviction of her entire block. For the needs of landlords and developers. And what she said, it's like when she first heard the word communism, she thought it was about being controlled. And now she recognizes it as having control. What does communism mean? She said it means like community. It means like, what she imagines is a communist union that is capable of collective control, of having a home for everybody. And I think that, as we work in our communities, and reflect on the work that we do, the names that we call it, I think are in some ways less important than those actions that we're taking. And the reflection on those actions is really where we get the access to those critiques of, oh, we need an entirely other kind of system. And maybe what we heard about, what the ideological project of the American dream and the propaganda that we receive about like even how history is made, like maybe all of that is wrong. And so I think I want to foreground the actions, the really revolutionary actions that tenants are taking right now as we think about what that future might be. And I think that, when we look at Echo Park Lake and what people were able to claim, when we look at, the Second Street Tenants Association taking back their garden and turning it into a meeting space, a space where they do food distribution. I think that we can see the relationship between these defensive practices and these offensive practices that really are headed towards changing our relationships to each other, building those ties of community that change the relationship to our housing, right? That displace the power of landlords to decide what is happening to the places that we live, and then like changing our relationships to our cities and to land, right? Like as we build local chapters to extract those concessions from the state and take care of our own needs. I think that is really pointing us to what that horizon might be. And so rather than, rather than claim that we have the answer, I think just to be grounded in the real, the really existing movement to abolish the present state of things that is happening right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, for me, there is a large global struggle that is happening at this moment against imperialism and hyper-imperialism that is trying to respond to those conditions. The United States is at the center of that struggle as an enemy, if we may say. And then inside there is this deconstruction, slow deconstruction of the system itself that they're trying to sell or impose in the rest of the world. And I just have an image that responds to this thing and the importance of what we're trying to do here. And a street corner on Fickett and Wabash in our neighborhood, there is a stoplight that tenants spent 7 years organizing to push to get in there. And it started by tenants organizing by painting the slow down lines, the yellow, the white and black lines that slow traffic down. And then I put out their own fake cross guards to slow down traffic that later on became the stoplight that we now have. In the opposite end, on Cesar Chavez, we have the same kind of situation where 100 people will cross the street to slow down traffic every day to force the city to put a stoplight. Right next to that corner in Fickett and Wabash, there is an alley where someone got beaten up long time ago, and the tenants decided to clean the alley and to clear all the junk there, and became like the authority in that neighborhood that make sure that alley would stay clean, and that then forced the city to do, rather than do symbolic cleanups in the main streets, to come to that neighborhood to clean up the street on a regular basis, and to bring dumpsters to clear the trash and the junk that periodically accumulates there, to clean that place. A couple of blocks from there, another committee is distributing food every other week because of they started that since the pandemic. In the same corner, you have benches for this bus stop, so people can stay there. And some people in some places have put all these signs that say, "Please don't pick up after your dog." All of this stuff has happened through community organizing over the years, and forcing the city to do what they need to do. All this stuff has happened through the leadership of this committee. So when people in the committee have problems, in the neighborhood have problems, they go to people in the committee and say, "Hey, we're having this problem." And then this committee comes together and organizers. If they can respond to the problem, they respond to the problem. If not, they go to the city and push the city to do this stuff. Another thing that I think I forgot that is also very important, along this path of this committee, along this street on Pickett, there used to be a lot of drug dealing. And the community started organizing all these activities on the street to create presence and really shift the presence of the drug dealing and minimize it to a certain degree, to such a degree that eventually the police was no longer needed. And when they had a big fair on that street, and the police said, "Oh, we're going to be there to protect you," the community said, "We don't need you here." To me, it is the community becoming aware that they are the ones who have to manage what happens in the neighborhood, that they're the ones who decide what needs to happen in the neighborhood. And then building that project as a project that happens in every neighborhood, in every community. So we built what I was talking about earlier, a people's democracy. They start with the most poor, deciding what they want against a capitalist system that tells them how the city should be. There is a contradiction between the city that we want to live in and the city that capitalism builds to speculate, to create consumerism, to move traffic, and to move goods across the city. The city that we want to live in is different from that. And these communities are building that. So that's where we're going. But it's a project that has to be organized, has to be militant, and has to be put together by everybody who lives in the city, who believes that the possibility is there for us to have a better system.
Perfectly said. Absolutely. It's about taking our lives into our own hands. It's about transcending a system of exploiters and exploited, the rich and the poor. It's about humans growing up. That's what communism means to me, advancing past what Albert Einstein called this predatory phase of human development, class society, where humanity is split up between those who have and those who don't, those who rule and those who are ruled over. That is something that I think my vision of communism is humanity overcoming precisely that. And I think, we're organizing towards that whenever we engage in activity like the LA Tenants Union and so many other organizations and movements throughout history and in the present. As a way to wrap up this conversation, I would really love, this is a big question, but you can take it in any direction that you would like. What advice would you give to anyone out there listening right now who might want to join, start their own, or take their existing tenant organizing to the next level?
When we talk with different organizers in different places, a lot of times we get asked, okay, how do we do this? And I think that is the wrong question. The question for me is, why do we have to do something? And we just need to do something. The other part of it is a lot of times these are individuals asking the question as individuals trying to do stuff. We need to build a collectivity with our neighbors, with other organizers, with other people. Understand that this project is a collective social process. And that is difficult at times, right? We're not always agreeing. Writing the book, Tracy and I not always agreed, but we had to figure out how to get past our disagreements to put together a book. When we're in the locals, we don't always agree on these things, but the collectivity is very, very important. So it's not about how to do this, but why do we need to start doing something? And as we said before, it is not about thinking our way into acting. It's not about predicting how things should look like, but really testing what we believe needs to happen and start doing it little by little. And if more people do it together, a larger impact we're going to have. And of course, we're going to make mistakes. But if we don't risk making mistakes, we're not going to do anything. And I think that's very, very important. So start by do it collectively, and know that if you're right, the community and the people that surround you are going to push back and join you in this process.
100%. Tracy?
Just to echo what Leo said and say that, we're asking, why is it important to do this? And then starting with, what is one thing that we're capable of doing now in this small group, right? It only takes 2 other people to start knocking on doors to hold a meeting, and it might even just take 1. And so I think that, thinking about not the horizon from the get, but just that next right action. What is something that this group of people is capable of that we think responds to the conditions that we're in, that takes us on the path to get there? And I think that, we have to commit to this understanding that this is a long process and it will take a long time. And many people have come before us who've paved the path for us. And it's our task to continue to pave the path so people can pick it up after us. And that process takes faith. Is it the question that you can ask about why you're committed to this? Part of what you do when you answer that question is speak to that faith, is to this desire for an entirely other way of organizing our relationships to each other and our time, our precious time on this earth. And I think recognizing that it's a worthy use of that minimal amount of time. And knowing that a small action actually has the capacity to create a lot larger actions in the future.
Definitely. The book is Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. Thank you so much, Tracy and Leonardo, not only for coming on the show, not only for writing this book, but for your years and years of organizing on the ground in your communities to make life better and move the ball and pave the road, as Tracy says, for those that come after. Highly recommend this book. Before I let both of you go, can you just please let listeners know where they can find you, your book, and any other work that you do online?
I mean, the saying is wherever books are sold, but of course you can buy it on the Haymarket website. I'm, on Instagram, and I won't say the new name, Twitter, at Tracy Rosenthal _. And Leonardo, Leo, I'm going to mix you up with your kid. What's your handle?
I was just about to check because my son and I have the same name. I will always get confused.
I looked it up. It's Vilchis Leonardo.
Cool.
Yeah. And we're also at uniondevecinos.org. Look at us at LA Tenants Union at the East Side Local of the LA Tenants Union.
Perfect. I will link to as much of that as possible in the show notes to make it even easier for people to contact the union, find you on Instagram, get the book, etc. Again, thank you so much for the work and for being so generous with your time today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Killer Mike, Bamboo. You already know. Yeah. No surprise, I'm from a gangbang culture, but we can keep it civil or pull a thing on ya. Southern California where the sun don't quit. Intergenerational gangs so sons don't quit. But immediately you see that the problems that's in my city are secondary to what's propelling it in my city. I mean, really break it down. Take poor, black and brown, educate them poor, take the jobs from out their town, then inundate them with sedative drugs and dumb TV. Locked into a zoo and hunted daily by the police. Then you get a group of youth who know they don't belong. Then they gather up and organize a number up strong. But see, the failure isn't seeing that the problem ain't the gang, it's the situation in the communities where we hang. So I'm so pro-gang, it might scare a motherfucker, cause I fix the misconception that the enemies are brothers.
Bang on the setup, bang on the setup, bang on the setup, upset the setup, bang on the setup, bang on the setup, bang on the setup, homie, we been set up.
I tell them I went from a street gang thing, then I joined a military fleet Marine Force thing. From a little bitty gang in the south of Los Angeles to dragging bodies out of their house to help a government who hell-bent on keeping money spent on the missile. The reality's the difference between them shits is little. We had the objective of arming up over money, and they had the objective of arming up over money. And we told kids, join us, we the truth. Lies about protecting our black to get recruits. Then we found out we getting killed for a hood, and we don't own a single speck of dirt on that hood. Whether in a zone down south in Decatur, or in the flatlands off of Lenox and La Brea, or in a low-rise project in Chicago, big money come in and buy up our body.
Throw your sets up, we about to upset the setup. We about to upset the setup, upset the setup. Throw your sets up, we about to upset the setup, upset the setup, upset the setup.
I do it for the Crips and the Blooders, BGF brothers, the real Freeway Ricky Ross and Chris Dutters. I do my thing for Hoover, I represent for Fort. So my folk and my people throw they set to support. Support Amina Matthew, she might say the shot. So maybe next summer no mamas gotta cry, cause maybe next summer nobody gotta die. Hell, even if we fail, somebody gotta try. The only way the system rule is somebody gotta lie. And the lie they told is old, they base it on your race. They separate you black, you brown, you yellow, and white face. Then we further separate by joining gangs and legislate that our neighborhoods are now at war like we are separate states. So the police occupy our hood to keep down all the drama. So the Starbucks they just built is comfortable for soccer mamas. And American apparel comfortable for all the hipsters. And it's zero tolerance for all you spicks and you niggas and you chinks and you crackers. And it ain't about who whiter and it ain't about who blacker, but the money is a factor. And the factor is the factories got moved up out the hood. When starvation is present and absent is a job, a man will simply starve or he will form a mob. If you should form a mafia, then you should think Sicilian. Buy the hood for real, every block, every building, every build, feed the children, gang bang, build, feed the children, feed the children, gang bang, on the system.